My husband forced me off our private jet, saying it was for family only. Little did he know I was the brains behind his company's biggest success. I said nothing, but hours later, he called me in a panic when he realized what I had done. I remember the cold wind hitting my face as I stood there, helpless and bewildered, watching the private jet soar into the sky without me. My heart sank, a heavy weight settled in my chest. I had always been a part of the plan, of his plan. Yet there I was, stranded on the tarmac, forced off with a single dismissive sentence. "It's a family-only trip." The words echoed in my head, sharp and cruel, but what really stung was the tone. There was no consideration, no apology, just a swift and emotionless decision. I couldn't believe it. I had spent years supporting him, building everything he had, but here I was, cast aside as if I were a mere afterthought. Thank you so much for being here and joining me on this journey. If these stories of resilience and self-discovery resonate with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It's free and it means the world to me as we continue to grow this incredible community together. Let's get started. First, I thought I misheard. Surely this couldn't be happening, not after everything I had done for him. The luxury of the private jet was just a symbol of the life we had built together, of my hard work behind the scenes. Yet as I stood there, eyes scanning the skyline, my hands trembling, reality sank in. He didn't need me anymore. I wasn't his partner. I was an accessory, a bystander to his success. The anger bubbled up inside me, but more than that, I felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal. What hurt the most wasn't the exclusion, but the coldness with which it was delivered. There was no explanation, no empathy. I had been integral to every major deal, every business strategy that led to the success he was now basking in. But today that meant nothing. I had been reduced to nothing more than a shadow of the woman I used to be, a mere fixture in his world that was now considered expendable. As the plane grew smaller in the sky, I felt a sudden chill down my spine. Was this it? Was I truly just a forgotten part of his life? A woman who had spent her youth, her intelligence, and her energy making his dreams a reality? My mind raced, piecing together everything I had silently endured over the years. The subtle neglect, the casual disregard for my contributions, and the way he would always take the credit for everything. But now, standing in the cold, I saw things clearly for the first time. And then, just as the jet disappeared into the clouds, I overheard something that would change everything. I was alone, abandoned and forgotten, but I still had ears. In the distance, I could hear his voice, his assistant's voice, and the words they spoke hit me like a slap to the face. "Once this deal goes through, we're set for life," he said, as though he were discussing his next vacation. "I don't need her anymore. Everything's running smoothly. She's not needed for the next step." My heart stopped. He wasn't talking about me. But the betrayal was even worse than I had imagined. This wasn't about a family trip. It was about his latest business venture, something I had poured my heart and soul into for years. The company's success, the success he now took all the credit for, had been built on my ideas, my strategies, and my sacrifices. Suddenly, the ground beneath me felt like it was slipping away. The realization hit hard. I wasn't the loving wife he leaned on for support. I was the forgotten woman behind the scenes, the one whose intelligence and hard work had been invisible to everyone, including him. And what stung the most was that this betrayal wasn't just personal, it was public. He was announcing to the world that I no longer mattered. At that moment, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had lived in the shadows for too long, constantly overlooked while he basked in the glory of everything we had built together. But now, in the cold wind and the silence that followed, I made a vow to myself. It was time for a change. It was time to take back what was rightfully mine. I knew I had the power. It wasn't in the form of physical strength or brute force. It was in my mind, my intellect, the very thing that had made him successful in the first place. And now, I was going to use it against him. As I walked away from the runway, my mind was already whirring with ideas, with plans. The wheels in my head were turning, and for the first time in years, I felt alive with purpose. I would make him realize just how much he depended on me, how much he had underestimated me. His success had never been his alone, and I wasn't going to let him forget that. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew it would take time, strategy, and patience. But I also knew that when the time came, when I executed my plan, it would be the sweetest revenge I could ever imagine. And he would regret every single moment of thinking he could discard me without consequence. But for now, all I had to do was wait. Let him enjoy his family-only trip. Let him celebrate his newfound success with his assistant, while I quietly worked in the shadows. I would be patient because sometimes the best revenge isn't immediate. It's the kind that takes time, the kind that builds slowly, until it hits with a force he never saw coming. I could already see the headlines. Business mogul's empire crumbles after betrayal from the woman who made it all possible. It was going to be beautiful. As I sat in the quiet of my empty living room, the only sound was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I had always been the calm one, the one who kept things running smoothly while the chaos of life unfolded around me. My name is Evelyn, and for the last decade I had been the quiet architect behind everything my husband Alex had built. On the outside we were the perfect couple. A beautiful home, a successful business, a family that seemed to have it all. But beneath the surface things were never as perfect as they appeared. I met Alex when I was just starting my career. I had big dreams and he was the charming, ambitious man who seemed to share those dreams. He was driven, smart, and had the kind of charisma that made people want to be around him. I fell for him hard, as many young women do when they meet someone who seems like the answer to all their hopes and desires. He was everything I wanted: successful, confident, and ready to take on the world. And for a while I thought I was the same to him. We got married quickly, swept up in the whirlwind of our growing relationship. In the early days he would include me in everything, seeking my advice on business matters, asking for my opinion on the direction of his company. It felt like a partnership, a true collaboration. I was happy to support him, to help him navigate the world of business that he had been so eager to conquer. But somewhere along the way things changed. The company grew larger and so did Alex's ego. He began to lean less on me for support and more on his own self-assuredness. What had once been a team effort turned into him making decisions on his own, without consulting me, as if my input didn't matter anymore. The first few times I let it slide. He was busy after all, running a growing empire. But then as time passed, it became clear that the relationship between us was no longer balanced. He was still the brilliant businessman, but I was the one who quietly made sure everything worked behind the scenes. The schedules, the meetings, the deals. Everything was orchestrated by me and he never once gave me credit. It wasn't about praise or recognition, but the feeling that I was invisible to him. I was no longer his equal, no longer the partner he once treated me as. I was just the wife, the one who made sure his coffee was hot and the house was in order while he did all the important work. I had put my dreams on hold for him, for us. I had set aside my own ambitions to help him achieve his, and it was something I did willingly. But somewhere in the process I lost myself. The woman who had once been eager to climb the corporate ladder had become a background character in her own life. I stayed home, I took care of the details, and I smiled when he took all the credit. But in the quiet corners of my mind resentment began to grow. I had built his empire with my ideas, my strategies, my late nights and early mornings. And yet it felt as if I had never existed in the story of his success. As the years passed I learned to hide my frustrations. I smiled when we attended parties, I clapped when his company reached new heights, but all the while I knew the truth. He couldn't do it without me, but he acted as though he could. That was the hardest part. The harder I worked, the more invisible I became. The more I contributed, the less he acknowledged it. And yet I stayed because I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I helped him enough, if I supported him enough, he would one day see me for who I truly was. But the truth was he hadn't seen me in years. He had grown so focused on his own ambitions that he couldn't even recognize the woman who had been by his side from the very beginning. I wasn't just his wife. I was the silent partner who had been the mastermind behind his success. The business strategy, the partnerships, the innovations, they had all been my ideas. I had taken his dreams and made them a reality, but that was something he had long forgotten. Then came the day I realized that nothing would ever change. It wasn't just the private jet incident that pushed me to my breaking point. It was everything that had led up to it. The constant dismissals, the lack of appreciation, the unspoken belief that he could do it all on his own. And I had let it happen. I had let myself become invisible, a shadow in the background of his life, always there but never truly seen. But the moment I overheard his conversation with his assistant, it was as if everything clicked into place. He had no idea how much I had done for him. He had no idea how much he relied on me. And in that moment something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to be the silent partner anymore. I wasn't going to fade into the background while he reaped all the rewards. If he wanted to throw me aside, then I would show him what it really meant to lose me. I had spent years building his empire, but now it was time for me to tear it down. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, my identity, and my worth. I was more than just a wife. I was the one who had made him who he was. And if he thought he could discard me without consequence, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The pain of betrayal ran deep, but I wasn't going to let it control me. I was going to use it. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment where he had taken me for granted. Those were the tools I would use to bring him down. Because in the end he needed me far more than he realized. And soon he would find that out the hard way. I walked through the house that night, the silence so loud it almost suffocated me. Alex was still on the jet, enjoying the life he had built without me, and I was left behind to pick up the pieces. I knew he would return eventually, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he was never coming back to the person I once was to him. It wasn't just the fact that he kicked me off the jet. It was everything that had led up to that moment. The quiet disregard, the way he had taken me for granted over the years, slowly erasing the woman I once was. The woman he used to respect. Every corner of our house felt like a reminder of what I had lost. I remembered the days when we'd dream together, when I'd offer suggestions and he would listen, appreciating the intelligence that I brought to the table. But those days felt like a distant memory, long buried under the weight of his success. His ambitions had grown so large that he had outgrown me, or so he thought. I had been his partner, his confidant, but now I was nothing more than a shadow. I couldn't help but replay the conversation I had overheard earlier, the one where he casually told his assistant that I wasn't needed anymore. His words were like a knife to my heart. I had given up so much to support his dreams, to ensure his success. And now it seemed I was nothing. To him I was just an accessory, a footnote in the story of his empire. But what really stung wasn't the words themselves. It was the finality with which he said them. There was no hesitation, no sign of guilt. It was as if I was disposable, easily replaced with someone who could make him feel more important. That night I sat in the quiet darkness, my mind racing. I had always been the calm one, the rational one, but now all of that was slipping away. My thoughts were clouded with anger, with the sting of betrayal. How could he do this to me? How could he forget everything we had built together? I had put my career on hold for him. I had sacrificed my own dreams for the sake of his. And now he was treating me like I was nothing more than a stepping stone. The rage I felt was overwhelming, but it was more than just anger. It was the feeling of being utterly discarded. For hours I sat in that living room trying to piece together the shattered pieces of my life. Every plan I had ever made for our future seemed meaningless now. I had thought that one day he would see everything I had done for him. That he would realize how much I had sacrificed for the success of his company. But now all I could see was how wrong I had been. He had never truly seen me. Not as a partner, not as an equal. To him I was just the woman who made sure everything worked behind the scenes. My thoughts swirled as I tried to make sense of it all. And then, in the midst of all that pain, I felt a shift. A quiet resolve began to form inside me. The anger I had felt turned into something more powerful, determination. I wasn't just going to sit back and accept this. I wasn't going to let him walk all over me anymore. I had given him everything, and now it was time to take something back. My mind began to work, slowly at first, then faster as the plan took shape. I thought about how he had made me invisible, how he had dismissed everything I had contributed. But there was one thing he didn't know: he couldn't do it without me. His success had always been tied to my hard work, my strategies, my knowledge. And now it was time for him to realize that. I wasn't going to destroy him, I was going to make him face the truth. The truth that he had built his empire on the foundation I had created for him. He had gotten too comfortable, too arrogant, thinking that he could do it all without me. It was time to shake him awake. I knew that if I was going to make him see what he had done, I needed to be smart about it. Revenge, I realized, didn't have to be messy. It didn't have to be about screaming or fighting. It was about precision, about making him understand the value I brought to the table. And to do that, I needed to start with the business. It was his most prized possession, the thing he loved more than anything. And I was going to make sure he saw just how fragile it was without me. The first step was simple. I began to look through the company's financial records, the contracts, the partnerships. I wasn't going to sabotage him immediately. I needed to find the cracks, the places where he had been careless. There were always things that slipped through the cracks when you got too big, too confident. And that's where I would strike. I would wait, watching, biding my time. I would let him continue thinking he had everything under control while I set the stage for his downfall. Days passed and Alex returned, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. He came back with the usual charm, the confident swagger that he always had, like nothing had changed. He didn't even notice that something had shifted in me. His arrogance was infuriating, but it also gave me the perfect opportunity to execute my plan. Every time he looked at me, I could see the detachment in his eyes. He no longer saw me as a partner. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. Instead, I watched him carefully, studied his every move. Every word he said, every decision he made, I was there. Quiet, observing, preparing. He had no idea that I was already working behind the scenes, that I had already begun to manipulate the systems he thought he controlled. I was already putting the pieces in place, setting up the business for a slow and inevitable unraveling. Each move I made was calculated, each action deliberate. It wasn't about ruining him. It was about making him feel the consequences of his actions. What hurt the most wasn't that he had wronged me. It was the realization that I had let it happen. I had been complicit in my own downfall. But now it was time to take back control. The path I had chosen was not easy, but it was necessary. And as I watched him go about his day, blissfully unaware, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It was time to show him just how much he depended on me. The days following Alex's return felt like an eternity, but I knew exactly what I was doing. The cold, silent treatment I had been giving him was nothing compared to the storm I was preparing to unleash. He had no idea that every moment of our interaction was a part of a larger plan, one that would bring him to his knees. I had long learned that nothing in this world was more powerful than information. It was the one thing that could make or break a person, and I had all the tools I needed to execute the plan I had carefully crafted. I had already started looking through the company's records, scanning for any vulnerabilities I could exploit. At first I felt hesitant. It felt wrong, but the deeper I went, the clearer it became that I had earned this moment. I had given him everything, sacrificed parts of myself I could never get back, and what had I received in return? Nothing but neglect and disrespect. This wasn't just about getting back at him. It was about reclaiming everything that was rightfully mine. The first step was subtle. I began to slip in small but critical changes to the company's financial systems. Nothing obvious, just adjustments here and there. A misfiled contract, a payment sent to the wrong account, a seemingly insignificant deal altered in favor of a rival company. To anyone else, they would appear to be honest mistakes. But to someone who knew the business as intimately as I did, they were deliberate. The more I adjusted, the more I could see the cracks beginning to show in Alex's carefully constructed empire. I'd never been the type to make rash decisions. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about wild gestures or hasty moves. It was about precision, and every action I took needed to be calculated to perfection. I had seen him handle problems before, the way he would react to small issues in the company, and I knew exactly what would shake him the most. It wasn't financial ruin, he could weather that. It wasn't public disgrace, he had a knack for spinning things to his advantage. No, what would hurt him the most was realizing that he had relied on me for everything, and that without me his empire would crumble. One evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing more financial documents, I felt a shift in the air. I had been careful, but the tension had been mounting for days. Alex was becoming more and more distracted, more erratic in his decisions. I could see the subtle signs. He was second-guessing everything, leaning on his assistants for help with things he had once managed on his own. It was a beautiful thing to watch, knowing that everything he was struggling with was because of me. I was in control and it felt empowering. But just as I was starting to feel the rush of success, a new challenge emerged. One of his closest business partners, someone who had been with him from the start, began to question the company's direction. The cracks I had caused were now becoming more visible, and I could sense that Alex was starting to panic. He wasn't stupid, he knew something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint it. And that was exactly how I wanted it. The more uncertain he became, the more I could manipulate the situation to my advantage. I continued working in the shadows, pulling strings, making calls, and sending emails that seemed innocent enough but were laced with consequences. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me, but I couldn't stop now. There was a part of me that wanted to stop, to walk away from the mess I was creating, but the other part, the part that had been neglected for years, refused to let me quit. Every step I took toward my goal felt like a step closer to justice, closer to a future where I wouldn't have to hide in the shadows anymore. This was my moment. Then came the day I had been waiting for. Alex, in his blind pursuit of control, made a critical mistake. He relied too heavily on one of his new advisors, someone who had recently joined the company and seemed too eager to impress him. I had been tracking this advisor's movements for weeks, noticing the subtle mistakes he'd been making. I had gathered just enough information to make a move. The next time he made an error, I was ready. I planted the seed, just a small piece of misinformation that would set off a chain reaction. It wasn't anything obvious, just a slight modification to a critical deal, something that would, in the right circumstances, be the downfall of the company. But Alex was too distracted by everything else to catch it. When the deal fell apart, the blame would fall squarely on him. He had made the decision, trusted the wrong person, and ignored the red flags that had been right in front of him. It was going to be the perfect storm, and I was the one holding the reins. I could almost hear the panic in his voice as I sat back and watched the chaos unfold. The calls, the frantic emails, the meetings with his team as they scrambled to salvage what was left. It was all part of my plan. And the best part? Alex had no idea that it was me pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Every minute that passed, every decision he made, brought him closer to the realization that he had lost control of the very thing he thought he owned. But there was a twist, one that I hadn't anticipated. As the company's financial troubles deepened, one of Alex's longtime investors, someone who had always admired him, started to doubt him. The cracks in his empire were becoming too obvious, and the investor was beginning to pull out. This was the final blow, the moment I had been waiting for. The very foundation Alex had built his empire on was starting to slip away, and it was all because of my careful planning. He had relied on me for so long, but now he was losing everything and he didn't even know how to stop it. The satisfaction I felt was bittersweet. This wasn't just about destroying him. It was about making him understand how deep my impact on his life really was. It was about proving that I was the one who had always been there, holding everything together while he took all the credit. Now it was his turn to face the consequences of his actions. I had always been the one to clean up his messes, to make sure everything ran smoothly. But now the tables had turned. As I watched Alex scramble to fix everything, I knew that it wouldn't be long before he realized the truth. It wasn't going to be easy for him to come to terms with the fact that he had lost everything. His business, his reputation, and me. And that, in the end, would be the most painful part of all. It felt like a heavy storm was brewing and I was at the eye of it, calm and steady while everything around me shattered. I watched Alex struggle, his usual confident demeanor replaced by frustration and confusion as the company teetered on the edge of collapse. It was happening just as I had planned. The decisions, the delays, the mounting errors. All of them leading to a crisis he had no idea how to fix. He had spent years believing he was in control, that everything he touched would turn to gold. But now, that illusion was being ripped away piece by piece, and it was all because of my careful design. I could feel the tension in the air as the stakes grew higher. His world was falling apart and I was the one pulling the strings. Each missed opportunity, each blunder, was another step closer to the moment of reckoning. But what I hadn't anticipated was the depth of his panic when things started spiraling faster than he could control. It wasn't just the company anymore. It was his reputation, his identity. And I wasn't just taking that away, I was forcing him to confront the one thing he could never ignore: the truth. I had always known that Alex had a fragile ego. His confidence was more like a mask, one that hid a deep insecurity he'd never let anyone see. That insecurity was about to be exposed to the world. As the deals began to fall apart and investors started pulling their money, he began reaching out to those he once considered allies. But the phone calls he made only seemed to make things worse. The people he thought he could rely on were distancing themselves, seeing him as a failure. A man who had let his arrogance get the better of him. The final blow came when the company's largest client, one of the pillars that held his empire up, decided to sever ties. I had orchestrated that too. Just a whisper here, a nudge there, a carefully timed leak that suggested Alex was losing his grip on the business. I had done it without lifting a finger, just by manipulating the narrative. When the news hit, Alex went white as a sheet, his eyes wide with disbelief. He couldn't understand what was happening, why everything was crumbling around him. And the worst part was he couldn't figure out who was behind it. It wasn't long before he came to me. I had been expecting this. The panic in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. It was everything I had imagined. He came home late that night, disheveled and exhausted as if he had aged years in a matter of hours. He walked through the door and stopped as if he hadn't expected me to be there. For a brief moment he seemed unsure whether to speak or walk away. But when he saw me sitting calmly on the couch, his voice cracked. "Evelyn," he began, his words laced with frustration, "what's going on? Everything's falling apart. The investors are pulling out, the clients are leaving, and I can't fix it. I need your help." It took everything in me not to smile at the irony of it all. After years of being the one who supported him, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, he was finally asking for my help. But it wasn't just the words he spoke that made me feel satisfied. It was the realization that I had turned the tables completely. He had always seen me as secondary, as just a helper. Now he needed me more than ever, and I was in no rush to offer assistance. "You need me," I said, my voice low and steady. "Where was your trust when it mattered, Alex? Where was your appreciation for everything I did to make this company what it is? You never saw me, never even acknowledged the role I played in your success." He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine, but there was a shift. It wasn't the old Alex, the one who always seemed to know exactly what to say to get what he wanted. This time he was vulnerable, unsure. It wasn't about the business anymore. It was about power. His power and his desperate need to reclaim it. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have never pushed you aside. You're right. You were always the one holding things together. But I didn't see it then. I was too caught up in everything, too focused on building something." His words hung in the air, thick with guilt. But I wasn't interested in his apologies. I wasn't interested in the man he was now, broken and begging for forgiveness. The truth was, I didn't need his apologies anymore. What I needed was justice. What I needed was for him to understand the consequences of his actions. "You know, Alex," I said, my tone cold, "this is the moment you've been dreading. Not the collapse of the company, not the losses, but the truth. The truth that you've been living a lie. That everything you've built was built on my back. I've been the one working, the one keeping things afloat. But you were too blinded by your own ego to see it." His face went pale. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had spent so long taking credit for my work that he had never even considered how it all worked behind the scenes. I wasn't just the quiet wife anymore. I was the mastermind. And now he had to face the fact that he had failed to see me for who I truly was. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came out. He was broken, defeated. For a brief moment I almost felt sorry for him. But then the memories flooded back. The years of sacrifice, the years of watching him take credit for everything while I stood in the background. There was no room for sympathy anymore. "Fix it yourself," I said, rising from the couch. "You always thought you were the one who had all the answers, didn't you? Now it's time to see how well you do without me." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, shattered and speechless. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had finally taken control of my life again, and in doing so, I had made him realize just how much he had relied on me. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. And Alex would never forget the lesson I had taught him. That no one could truly thrive without those who quietly worked behind the scenes. I left Alex standing in the living room, his shoulders slumped, his face ashen. For the first time in our relationship, I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy for him. I had spent too many years catering to his needs, prioritizing his dreams, and hiding my own desires beneath the weight of his ambitions. Now, in the silence of that moment, I understood something deeply. He wasn't the center of my world anymore. I was. Walking through the house, I could feel the echo of my steps in every corner, the walls witnessing my transformation. The woman who had been invisible, who had allowed herself to be pushed aside, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had reclaimed her voice, her purpose, and her power. And as I stood there reflecting on everything that had happened, I knew that the future was mine to shape. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and conversations. Alex's attempts to salvage what was left of his company were futile. The investors he had relied on were pulling out, one after another, citing the lack of trust and the instability that had taken over. The media, ever eager for a story, began to pick up on the whispers of his downfall. It wasn't long before the world knew the truth, that the once invincible mogul was crumbling, and the woman who had always been in his corner was no longer there to pick up the pieces. But what truly struck me wasn't the fall of his empire, nor the way people rushed to distance themselves from him. It was the realization that I had changed too. I had spent years holding on to a version of myself that was defined by my relationship with him. But now for the first time I was free. I wasn't defined by his success, his failures, or his constant need for validation. I was my own person with my own future to build. As I watched Alex flounder in the aftermath, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. There was a part of me that had expected to feel triumphant, to savor the sweet taste of victory after all the years of frustration. But instead I felt something else: clarity. The past, with all its disappointments and betrayals, had finally been put to rest. There was no satisfaction in watching him fall, no joy in seeing him lose everything. What mattered now was that I had taken control of my own life. Over the following weeks, Alex's world continued to unravel. His attempts to salvage his business were met with resistance from those who had once been his closest allies. The clients who had been loyal to him for years began to seek out other options, and the reputation he had spent so long building slowly disintegrated. In the midst of all this chaos, he reached out to me again, his messages full of apologies, of pleas for reconciliation. But it was too late. I had already moved on. One day I received a letter from him. It was a simple note filled with regret, asking for forgiveness. He acknowledged that he had taken me for granted, that he had failed to see my worth until it was too late. It was the apology I had always wanted to hear, but I realized that I no longer needed it. I had forgiven him long before he had the chance to apologize. The forgiveness I sought wasn't for him, it was for me. I had let go of the anger, the bitterness, and the resentment that had held me captive for so long. With that, I made my decision. I didn't respond to his letter. I didn't need to. The healing had already begun, and it was happening on my terms. I had learned to prioritize myself, to value my own happiness and well-being above all else. Alex had been a part of my life for so long, but he no longer had any power over me. His downfall wasn't my doing. It was a consequence of his own actions, of the choices he had made to neglect the very thing that had helped him succeed. The weeks turned into months and life began to settle into a new rhythm. I found myself rediscovering passions I had long forgotten, pursuing goals that had been put on hold for far too long. The freedom I felt was liberating. I no longer had to fit into the role of the dutiful wife, the silent partner in his success. I was my own person and the world was full of opportunities. Alex's fall from grace became a cautionary tale, one that people spoke about in hushed tones. He had learned the hard way that no one achieves greatness alone. And the people who had been there for him, who had made his success possible, were the ones he had pushed aside when he thought he no longer needed them. In the end, it wasn't the collapse of his business that destroyed him. It was the realization that he had lost the one person who had truly believed in him, the one person who had supported him unconditionally. As for me, I learned something invaluable during this time. Revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about reclamation. I hadn't destroyed Alex. He had destroyed himself. All I had done was stop playing the role he had cast me in. The revenge I had sought wasn't in ruining him. It was in finding my own path, in rediscovering who I was without him. The lesson I learned was that my worth was never tied to his success, his approval, or his love. I had always been enough on my own. And so, I moved forward, free from the weight of the past. The future was mine to create, and I had all the tools I needed to build something greater than I had ever imagined. The journey wasn't over, but it was mine to define. The revenge I had sought had been sweet, but the real victory was in the freedom I had found. It was in the strength to let go of what no longer served me and the courage to walk into a new chapter of my life. And in the end, that was the most powerful victory of all.